Well, good morning. It's nice to see a few friendly faces. Right, it's just for the camera. So I've seen some of you before, and I guess I'll say some things that some of you probably already know, but other things that are just for the record and the video. So how many of you live in Homewood again? Okay, so some of you I recognize from meetings, others I don't. I worked for the city as a city planner for a couple years, and I worked on this project for a year. So basically, to make a long story short, I'm going to start with why Homewood is considered a historic neighborhood, and then I'm going to talk about briefly the origins, what it's significant for, and then we can just open it for discussion, because I think it's worth talking about not only the designation process, but what it means and what preservation does right and what it does wrong, and how understanding can be reached, and what the issues are in preservation today, moving forward. So this is a rendering from the promotional brochure that David C. Bell created to promote his development in North Minneapolis. It was platted about 1909, marketed as suburban style development, basically. The city was a dirty place, strange zoning laws at that time. Wasn't as nice in some ways as it is now. So a lot of people would just move to the exurbs, and this shows how Homewood was related to Theoworth Park and the chain of lakes, and people could have large lots and be close to nature. Well, it deviated from the grid with some curvilinear streets, so you would have changing views. It was kind of based on, we'll talk more about the designers. It was, the idea of the romantic English countryside influenced the platting of the streets. So again, from the promotional brochure, it was marketed as improved and restricted, which I think is an interesting thing to talk about today. There was kind of this urban myth that there were housing covenants in Homewood. And this is ironic because it ended up being a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And I think the interesting thing about it is that through not only... Louder? Sure. Okay, not just my research, but Penny Peterson is a researcher who's doing a book on housing covenants in Minneapolis, and she found no evidence that there were any racial or ethnic housing covenants. The only covenants that were in place on deeds were basically design guidelines. You had to spend a certain amount of money on your house, you had to have a appropriate certain setback from the sidewalk, and the foundations had to be 3 feet above grade. So again, it prevented things like slab-on-grade homes with a certain minimum price to spend on a house, which wouldn't be legal today under the Fair Housing Act unless you're in a gated community. You get a certain design standard. So moving forward, just to show you where it is, most of you know, it's just north of Bryn Mawr in the Willard Hay neighborhood. So again, the city, okay, let me start. So there was a Section 106 review as part of the Blue Line Light Rail extension, which is an important thing to talk about moving forward. There's also about $80 million worth of development going at the corner of Penn and Plymouth, some of it starting right now. So that's one thing to remember as we talk about towards the end of the presentation, that nothing stays the same and things change. Preservation's one tool to deal with change. So Homewood was, the federal government found that Homewood was eligible for national listing as primarily for its Jewish social history. And that's really its... Oh, on the housing covenants? Well, we'll talk about that later, but Minneapolis was basically, through research, was one of the most anti-Semitic cities with covenants, yeah. Not in Homewood, but there were others in South Minneapolis. South Minneapolis in particular was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant bedroom community that didn't like people of color, didn't like anything other, didn't like Jews. So we can talk about that later. So Homewood was found to be eligible for listing as district for its relation to Jewish social history. And as part of research looking at building permits, basically looking at homes that still retained integrity and were built during this historic time period, you have, like the map says, 213 out of 250 properties considered historic, which would be protected from demolitions or inappropriate alterations. So again, it's pretty historic. This was what the HPC, the Historic Preservation Commission, found to be fact, that Homewood is significant for 5 out of 7 preservation criteria. So to put it simply, it's a very historic neighborhood. To be designated, they only have to be proven under 1 criteria. So again, Jewish social history is primarily what it's significant for. Jews settled in both the north and south side, but they congregated strongly in the north along Plymouth Avenue. That's where the greatest concentration of businesses were. The most affluent citizens lived there. It's where they went to school. They had synagogues. And again, as we'll talk about anti-Semitism, because Jews couldn't get work in government positions, they couldn't get hired by corporations, businesses, the mills wouldn't hire them. This mill wouldn't hire Jews. And then again, like divide and conquer, just like we see nowadays with people of Islamic faith or other, they tell these working class Swedes and Germans who they're underpaying and making work under very dangerous conditions that they're better than the Jews. They're better than blacks, and divide and conquer, and the ruling class treats everyone like crap who they're using to profit. And ultimately, I think the story about Homewood and the Jewish social history is that it was this triumph over anti-Semitism. They couldn't get into any country clubs, so they built their own exclusive community. And it was exclusive. Socioeconomically, they had these design guidelines. They were separated, by the boundaries of the neighborhood from even working class Jews. And there were many entrepreneurs, lawyers, again, because they couldn't find jobs in government or private sector, they became self-employed as doctors, lawyers, a lot were businessmen, but you had everything from barbers to junk salesmen, seamstresses. You had women who were listed in directories as business owners, which is, I just always think it's important to note, especially, in the 20s and 30s when women are owning businesses or running businesses with their husbands. Some significant people, there was a mayor who lived in Homewood and built a home during his tenure there, Mayor Nye. Anthony Morrell was a landscape architect who was apparently one of the rock star landscape architects of his time. The Kaplan brothers lived there. I'll talk a little bit about them. Lyle Behrman, who founded the Wilson's Leather Company, and significant Pope, Rabbi Aronson. Bethel, when they moved out to Golden Valley, they named a wing in his honor. Here's the Mayor Nye as a young man. Anthony Morrell. This was Sidney Kaplan. So he lived in a big house on Washburn Avenue. His parents, Max and Hattie, were Lithuanian Jewish immigrants. Max was a wholesale grocer, did quite well. He ran his business out of the warehouse district in another historically listed building. And Sidney's interesting because, again, these are smart boys. Sidney went to Harvard. He went to law school, and he served on the Nuremberg Commission. So that's kind of a big deal for a boy from Minneapolis. His brother Sheldon also became a lawyer and was actually instrumental in getting the Minnesota Vikings franchise to Minnesota, and he served as their general counsel for decades. He never retired, and he died when he was 96. So these are some of the locally significant people, past. We'll talk about some of them present too. It was found significant for city identity. Again, just the plating of the streets, the stone street markers in the park make it very identifiable in North Minneapolis as a special neighborhood. You can see as they looked in 1910, they look very much today. And I think it's also worth noting they were rebuilt by the current community in the 90s, which shows the change of the neighborhood to a very inclusive, diverse community that's working together and really takes a lot of pride in the neighborhood. Significant for architecture, Liebenberg and Kaplan. Again, the first Jewish-run architecture firm in the state of Minnesota. Liebenberg, he went to Harvard. I forget where Kaplan, I think he went to the U of M. And they're most famous for their design of movie theaters, like the Uptown Movie Theater, the Hollywood in Northeast, but they did a lot of really wonderful residential architecture also. Perry Crozier, interestingly, he wasn't Jewish, but looking at building permits, he did a lot of work with the Fleischer Construction Company, and the Fleischer brothers also lived in Homewood. Fleischer sounds like a Jewish name to me, although I didn't find any definitive research on that. And yeah, Perry Crozier is recognized as a master architect, and there's about a dozen homes of his in Homewood, as well as a dozen by Liebenberg and Kaplan. Tyree Gage and Chapman were also known as rockstar architects. They designed several libraries, some landmarks that are already existing, buildings in the warehouse district. Here's one house on Washburn Avenue that Liebenberg and Kaplan did. It's also where, not Alan Page, Carl Eller of the Purple People Eaters lives there. And he has these, Carl Eller lives there. And I don't have a picture of it here in the slideshow, but he has these like cut out, painted silhouettes of football players in the front yard, so those wouldn't be considered historic, but they're still kind of cute nonetheless. The home that Perry Crozier did is the only brick house. According to the building permit, it's not brick veneer, it's load-bearing brick, and it was built for Louis Fleischer. Again, the Fleischer Construction Company. He had his friend, an architect, design it for him. His firm built it. His brother lived a couple blocks away. And like, I've looked at enough of their buildings around town. These builders were so good. The walls are so plumb. You can even see like raked mortar joints that are like 80 years old. You can check permits. They've never even been repointed. It's just they built buildings very well. And there's not a lot of definitive research on them, but the city considered them for this purpose to be master builders. And it's just a collection of period revival architecture, which probably all you know about if you live there. You know, some modest houses as well as big ones. This guy, Sam Katz, again, presumably Jewish by his last name. Again, worked with the Fleischer brothers, worked with Perry Crozier, did a lot of Tudor revival houses. And the story that you get when you look at these building permits and do this research is that you see siblings of Jewish faith living a couple streets from each other. You see them hiring Jewish builders, you know, builders like Moses Hyman. You know, you see people who owned a business, you know, again, a Jewish-run butcher shop blocks away who lived there. And the building permits and the research and the directory listings just show a story of a very tight-knit community, which is special, I think. Maurice Mandel, he was the architect who designed this house. He built the Mikro Kodesh Synagogue, which is a couple blocks outside of Homewood on Oliver, which is listed as a landmark both locally and nationally. And again, there's a lot of homes with good integrity that basically look the same as they did 100 years ago, just like this one too, right off the park. But then, you know, and there's houses of worship too, again, which show the community. But there's also integrity issues. You see how when houses have been replaced, they're typically replaced with something up at the top. And we can certainly talk about that. And there's some houses down on Vincent. There was one that was recently remodeled, and that's something else to talk about as we open up into conversation. So the interesting thing is the city, through community meetings, we were having conversations to determine this period of significance. The federal government and other consultants chose 1963 as a cutoff point. That's when the Jews basically abandoned Homewood. They left. 63, that's when the Plymouth riots took place. Well, for the purpose of this study, what we found out talking to neighbors is that nobody liked ranch architecture. And it's interesting because like the peak of Homewood, peak of, you know, architect designed houses, which we also found the district significant for, ended right around the Second World War. After that, World War II, I mean, face it, housing just became cheaper. They weren't using as good materials. People didn't have as much money to spend. And when we were talking to people in Homewood, sorry if anyone lives in a ranch house, nobody thought that was architecture worth saving. Nobody wanted to save the apartment buildings. And the fields, which was considered contributing, people thought, hey, it'd be great if that could be opened up for development at some point in the future, if that would be good for the community. So it's kind of this give and take with these meetings. We chose 49 to get the architecture that people really felt strongly about saving, and to also allow for economic development at some point in the future. Yeah, yeah. Right. Oh, absolutely, and loose-drawn homes. So, I mean, one side of me obviously sees that even the ranch houses are significant for Jewish social history, but locally we're trying to just come up with this compromise that preserves a lot of the neighborhood, allows for change in the future, and listens to the community. Again, people like Van White, the first black city council member in Minneapolis. He was a Homewood resident. He was really instrumental in revitalizing the neighborhood through HRA grants. Vivian Jenkins Nelson has lived there for, I think, again, since about 63 or maybe a little bit later, maybe the 70s. She's internationally renowned diversity consultant. She's consulted with corporate America. She's advised 4 US presidents. She's kind of a big deal. You wouldn't necessarily know it, but she lives there today. Again, we'll talk about this woman, Bernadette Anderson. She lived at 1244 Russell Avenue North in the 70s. She was a social worker, and while she isn't necessarily considered significant, some of the lovable rugrats in her house were. The little guy here. So this is Prince when he is about 15. And this is his buddy, Andre Simone. And after Prince's parents separated, Prince lived with some family, but ultimately settled with his friend, lived in the basements. And he loved living in the basement because he could play guitar all night long and never be bothered, and that's how he got so good. Andre Simone played bass. This is his sister. They had a band called Grand Central. This is Morris Day. This is just some dude, and that's just some other dude who happened to be in the picture. They didn't become amazing musicians. And Terry Lewis lived next door. Terry Lewis, Jimmy Jam, they produced Janet Jackson records, and big producers, still are. So this is an example of like these two houses could kind of be considered a separate little historic district within their own context of Minneapolis music. And that's, again, a context that the city wants to explore someday, is that there's a lot of amazing musicians who came out of the north side, and that there's something to tie that together. So again, this is him in Bernadette Anderson's house. He lived here until he was signed by Warner Brothers. Then he moved to Uptown, and then he went into the stratosphere. So I guess I just want to state a couple things and then open it up for conversation. So I guess why preserve Homewood? I think it's interesting for the social aspects of preserving things that are historically significant, but also environmentally. A lot of these houses are just built well, and they can be maintained. Doing things like preserving wood windows. This has great benefits for the environment. It saves people money. There's a lot of environmental benefits that also can benefit homeowners in the pocketbook, depending on their approach. And the other thing is, with this slide I showed up here, when houses get torn down and replaced, they kind of look like the ones up north, or up top. And that's another thing about the social and economic dynamics of the north side, which is a tool that preservation can offer. I think a lot of the community does preserve homes as best as they can and doesn't really want to see them be replaced. But it's another thing to talk about the Blue Line light rail extension, all the development going up there. If you want to talk about gentrification, which is something that came up, what do gentrifiers love? They love bike trails, they love historic neighborhoods, they love food trucks, they love little restaurants, they love being really close to their good, high-paying jobs in downtown. And Homewood has all of that. Oh, and the housing stock's cheap. Some of those houses, they're in South Minneapolis, they're $700,000. You can get them for $200,000 in Homewood. And I know a lot of the communities talked about how there's different people moving in, and there's concerns about that, and it's hard to control that. But another thing with the light rail extension, which people have to realize, is that planners, there's a term transit-oriented development. They see these major transit corridors, and they want to plan to bring people into the city for jobs. And there's so much pressure to develop, and there's such a housing boom. that again, the city could use things, or the government could use things like eminent domain, or not even eminent domain, just give people a good price for their land and do things like build, you know, multifamily housing right on Washburn Avenue, overlooking the park, right by the light rail. You could build expensive condos. And I'm not saying this is going to happen now or 5 years, but at some point in the future, that would really change the quality of that neighborhood. You know, because yeah, lawyers would love to live, look at the park, watch the sunsets, go take the light rail to their corporate job. Yeah, yeah. Whereas, very close. You know, I just have a couple more thoughts, and then I really want to open it up for conversation. So I think preservation is also a tool to preserve a diverse neighborhood that has modest houses as well as very stately houses, and design guidelines, which I'm not going to talk about right at the moment. The way they were written with feedback is they could allow things like vinyl windows if people want them. They don't want it to be an economic burden. You know, and they would prevent very large houses from replacing very modest houses. So in a sense, you would preserve very modest houses and in a way still create a supply of affordable housing. So I know this is a sensitive issue, and where preservationists fail is that they're highly educated people like myself with advanced degrees, start talking about how they mean well and know all this, but it doesn't pair up with what's on the ground. But I still think there's something really important in this neighborhood that has been preserved without any kind of regulation or without any special status. But moving on to the future, that might not be enough. I mean, things like the Dayton's Bluff neighborhood in St. Paul on the east side has been a historic district for 30 years. It's the largest one in St. Paul, one of them. And that has not gentrified that neighborhood in the least, but it has prevented demolitions. And you also have a very strong, resilient community. But then, you know, like you see in Linden Hills, there's nothing significant about the architecture or the community. And there's no legal reason to preserve it. It's just a desirable neighborhood by the lakes. And whereas I could maybe, if I had a partner, buy a home there, small, modest home to start off on, what's happening is people don't want to live in Edina. They buy a $300,000 house, they tear it down, you know, they build something they can flip for $1.2 million, and that's the trend. So that's an example of how market forces just gentrify, whereas preservation can actually be a tool that really does a lot and allows a community to change over time, so that when houses are built on vacant lots or houses that are not considered historic or torn down, you have some standard of what things look like that people generally agree on. So with that, I just want to open up for conversation. I don't work for the city anymore, so I'm really kind of impartial. I was just really so happy and so pleased to learn about this community through research, through meeting people, and just know more about this city that I live in. So let's talk. Okay. Oh.
Hi, my name is Fred Olson, and I've lived in Homewood for almost 40 years, not quite historic, but Alex, I think your presentation was more sensitive to community concerns than some of the ones at the meetings that I've been to. And I guess I was going to comment on kind of the neighborhood perspective, of which I'm kind of in the middle of the range of opinions. For the record, I guess I am in favor of historic designation if the guidelines are loose enough that it doesn't impede what residents can do to their houses very much. I find it interesting that the top requirement or rationale for designation are the social, but most of the talk is about preserving the architecture, which, while significant, I'm not sure it rises to what I would call historic significance, the architecture itself. One question I had for you is, you sort of answered this, but you know, there's a range of how houses, the design of houses can be done relative to the residents. You know, some residents design their own house and some buy spec houses. Where on that scale would you say, I mean, was there something particularly Jewish about the houses other than, you know, a few features that we're familiar with that was particularly Jewish in nature, or Was it just the architecture of the time, or?
Well, I mean, to answer some of your question about the architecture, the designation would protect the outside of the house. And I don't know if there's anything really Jewish per se about the outside of the house. I think it was just a nice collection of architecture at the time. Some of the interior features, from what I understand, the pantries, kosher style eating, definitely have significance. But the point is that federal preservation standards dictate even if a building is significant for social reasons, you still preserve historic building materials. And that's just the way preservation is done. But again, for example, if historic windows were thrown out and replaced at some time, then standards just say replace it with something compatible. So for example, if it was a double hung window, it would be replaced with a double hung window, not a slider window. And again, I worked in the Minneapolis public schools, in Northside schools for years before I went to graduate school. So I'm very familiar with the social dynamics of the North Side. I'm very familiar with the families. I've met a lot of families. And as someone who lives in Minneapolis, what really concerns me is that we see some places of the city that are very wonderful. And the North Side just has this terrible reputation when really it's a wonderful place. And yeah, there's some bad stuff that happens in some parts, but there's bad stuff that happens everywhere. And the trouble with these dynamics is you go to these community meetings and Northside residents say, we want bike lanes, we want nice boulevard plantings, we want all this stuff that the rest of the city has. And then the city says, okay, we'll just put a little easement on your property taxes and call it a day. And then Northside residents say, well, you can't do that. That would be an economic burden to low-income people here. And the more middle-class people take that position because they love their community and they don't want it to be a burden economically. But to have a great city, we have to find a way to do these things, to get bike lanes, to get nice boulevard plantings. You know, a historic district is really a special honor, and this would be the largest residential historic district in the city. And it's a way of just saying, the North Side is amazing, has this very special history, and we really want to focus it on that, not on crime and shootings and gangs. So I don't know if I'm getting away from your question, but preserving the historic architectural elements are important, but creating design guidelines for the needs of the community, from what I understand, and I'm not involved with this process anymore, would allow for things like, you know, using cheaper materials like vinyl windows, for example, that typically wouldn't be done in preservation, but exceptions would be made for the needs of the community. And then there's some things, for example, I'll share a story, maybe you heard from one of your neighbors, because I feel awful that in some ways the designation process has torn this community apart, and I really think it should bring communities together. I think there was this one guy and his partner who pulled a permit for $20,000 to replace every single window in their house with vinyl windows. They didn't know about the designation, so that's fair. But they were dealing with the contractor who should have known, and they were dealing with the contractor who charged them a deposit before getting their building permit, which is illegal. It's not a crime, but it is not legal. And then they get a call. These people are throwing a fit because they can't get a permit for their windows. They tell me to come over and look at their windows, and I do, and they're fine. I mean, these were old-growth Douglas fir windows. There were no broken panes. They needed a little glazing putty. They needed to be cleaned. The sash cores worked. They all operated. And ultimately, to make a long story short, they went to the HPC. They got their vinyl windows, but they also bought the cheapest vinyl windows possible. I have vinyl windows that were put in my apartment building 7 years ago. 4 of them don't even seal properly anymore because they just don't work in this climate. But, you know, that's the other thing to talk about is I worked in the North Side and I worked in the schools, and I know some members of your community who went to school, and one of them I was actually in a college class with when I started at MCTC. And I had to correct one of his papers. And the grammar, the syntax was so bad with an adult. I just went to the professor. I said, I just don't know what to say. And the professor said, this is just the difference between the education this person received to graduate high school and the one that you received. So you're dealing with people. We all have our heart in the right place. But again, this is where preservation fails. You know, an education or a lack thereof is not really what this is about. It's about preservationists are coming across as knowing better, knowing more, and people who honestly just get intimidated by big words and smart people who can't see eye to eye and can't have a productive conversation. And that's something I hope we can talk more about. And I think you're leading right into this.
Okay, you sort of alluded to the controversy in the neighborhood about the proposed designation.
Right.
My hunch is that there may be enough opposition it won't pass city council. It's hard to say at this point.
It's hard to say.
But it seems like a possibility. Part of that is that there is the perception that it was people people who are not currently residents proposing it, and outsiders without consulting the neighborhood. And I think I would urge the preservationists to be more careful about doing your groundwork before proposing something like this. That if it comes out of the neighborhood as a good idea, its chances of success are much better. Okay? Now, I've been to a number of meetings, and some of which were very controversial. And you know, the extreme views tend to get more extreme when people get heated. The perception that it will make it much more expensive to maintain your house, whether true or not, is widespread. And once that perception becomes common, it's hard to reverse it. I thought I would read a few. I found out about this meeting yesterday. By the way, about half of us here are from the neighborhood. Okay, and I don't know, but I'm guessing some of them found out about the meeting yesterday. And so there was a response to the short notice and the location. I thought I'd just read a few of the short responses that I had to having posted it. Some from white residents, some from black residents, by the way. I find it strange that some group is talking about this without intentionally reaching out to those of us who live here, also at a time and location relatively inaccessible to many. She didn't know about it was part of an ongoing series, I presume. Someone else said, there's so little information about this group and who this person leading the discussion from 8 to 9 a.m. Does anyone from Homewood know of this? Another resident said, thank you for sending this. I cannot make the meeting. Please let me know what is going on. I am not in favor of the change. The area is still already unique. Another resident said, we follow Minneapolis, Preserve Minneapolis page on Facebook and have known about this for a month. I just, you know, it seems like the process could have been better, and I hope in future preservationists realize this.
Those are all good points.
What is the step? At what point has the Heritage Preservation Commission gotten in this designation process?
Well, to answer that, the Heritage Preservation Commission has already decided that it is historic, and they are recommending to the City Council that the City Council make it official. And what's interesting is that the council member from this ward has recommended to the planning department at CPED that they look into homeowner financial incentives for historic preservation, which are very rare in preservation. And I think it's a wonderful idea. And I was talking with a council member who's running for office who would be in favor of basically just waiving all building permit fees for single family historic houses, which would be just a great direct benefit.
What ward is this?
What is it, Ward? You're in Ward 3, right? Five.
Ward 5.
Right. Which is great because that would also alleviate some financial burden and provide incentive to not only do preservation, but also to get building permits. Because again, you've had to pull a building permit for anything since 1882 in Minneapolis. And that's one of the things that makes Minneapolis a desirable place to live, is because when you buy a house, you know generally that it's had permitted work. In other cities where you can just do whatever you want, it's kind of like buyer beware. You buy your house, it has faulty electrical wiring, it burns down, and you lose everything because insurance doesn't cover that kind of stuff. So I think that's a wonderful idea, and I think it's wonderful that the conversation is shifting towards how can homeowners benefit by maintaining their houses as they can afford to, as opposed to like developers who go into the warehouse district, $1 million projects, and take advantage of very large federal tax incentives.
Yeah, this is Fred Olson again. I just realized that there was a major point, I guess, that I forgot to mention, and that is that the historic designation is based on the Jewish population. But those of us who live there for maybe not quite 50 years, which I understand is kind of the threshold, feel that what's happened since the Jewish population is also significant.
Right.
And while you mentioned it, it's too early for the 50-year designation, probably. I mean, it's on the threshold there. But I always describe the neighborhood as 50-50 white and black with some others mixed in, so you can't do 50. But, and that it has worked relatively well.
Right.
I mean, this country's original sin of racism affects everything, and it hasn't been perfect by any means. But by and large, it's been relatively successful compared to what's happened in other places and other times. And it seems to many of us that that should be part of the historic designation as well. Now, maybe it would affect the timing. Wait a few years and it will have been historic in terms of whatever. But, and indeed, you did mention it in your thing. And like I said, I think your presentation this time was better than some I have seen at earlier presentations on the proposal. But I just wanted to get that on there.
Right. I mean, I think that's a thing to talk about is this is a very historic, very special neighborhood. It doesn't mean it stopped being historic in 1963. I think what's happened since then is very special and very unique. But the issue with finding basically a legal reason within a study is that something has to be historic within a context, and we have, a context of Jewish social history, a context of architecture. We don't have a context of, post 1963, racial harmony kind of living. But I agree, it's a very special neighborhood even to this day with special people, and it's one thing to say, yes, it's a special neighborhood, but it's another thing to say it's historic because of that when you're talking about people who are still living.
So like Fred said, my understanding is that this all began with the social Jewish history, and that's what has made this significant. And today when you said we should save the building materials, we should save architecture, that was the first time I've ever heard anything like that, because this whole time it seems like everyone says this is a significant Jewish location, this is a significant Jewish neighborhood, and we need to preserve it because of that, but it's being driven by people who aren't Jewish, who, what kind of communication have you had with the Jewish neighborhood, with the Jewish Historic Society? What do they think of this? Are they
We have
in favor?
had contact, or when I worked at the city, we had contact with the Jewish Society, the Upper Midwest, the Jewish Historic Society, and while there are hardly any Jews still living in Homewood, they are very supportive of this, and there are other prominent citizens who don't live in Homewood or Minneapolis anymore, but again, you're talking about like third-generation lawyers who are very successful, very supportive of this designation because this is where their roots are from.
Yeah, and I've heard nothing from the Jewish perspective. I've heard nothing from any Jewish community. I've only heard architects. I've only heard people from outside the neighborhood saying we need to save this, but the reason that we're supposed to be saving this hasn't been represented.
I mean, this is where, again, like, I don't know, that preservation, I think it's bringing up preservationists are failing to communicate, or, again, things like a meeting like this. I mean, social media is a good way to promote this rather than spending, $400 on stamps and mailing people letters, and we're still not going to get any better turnout. But again, the way preservation works is so we say, okay, it's historic for this time period, and we want to keep it generally looking like that more or less, more or less. Additions are allowed. I mean, alterations are allowed, but it's the idea about keeping them compatible. So in other words, people say, hey, I have a nice stucco house, I want to put vinyl siding on it, then it just doesn't really look like it did during that time period. And the other point is people are really doing that anyways, for the most part. What you see, which I'll tell one more interesting story. So you have this one, just house flipper, bought that house on Vincent Avenue that has vinyl siding all over it now. You know, he's not invested in the community the way that's the story, is you get people who moved here very intentionally to live there and have lived here for decades and know their neighbors and plant flowers and work together. And that's what really makes it special today and really unique even amongst neighborhoods in the Twin Cities, at least from my outside perspective. So again, but it's also about the architecture, because that's also what it's significant for. It's a combination of all these elements. I mean, we also found by looking at the research that there were all these very significant Minneapolis architects who designed houses there, and that's what made this community special, is that they were hiring Jewish architects, and they were hiring architects and lots of Jewish builders. And so while it's, like I say, it's, when you do the study, it's hard to say, like, okay, if it wasn't for the Jewish social history, would it be considered historic for its architecture? Probably not. Are any single homes significant for their architecture? A couple, but the strength is really as a whole and what it is. And so again, I don't know if I really answered your question, other than the fact that,
Yeah.
I mean, the city it's part of the comprehensive plan they don't mandate historic preservation, but we do it.
Yeah.
Like the Armory was an example where the city just said, we're doing it, and it's special, and we don't care whether people are like it or not, because it's a special building. And so the city, again, got federal money to finish this Section 106 review, and then you basically have the research that says, well, this is a very historic place, and Minneapolis does preservation, so let's see what the HPC says, and let's see what the city council says. SHPO is very supportive. They're not involved, they advise. They just say, we agree with the research, we agree with the facts.
My question was, are the synagogues from that time, are they individually designated as historic? Because most of them are around Homewood, not in Homewood. And the other thing is, are these buildings going to get plaques that say, you know, built by architects, blah, 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 in the dates and stuff like that?
Okay,
like, you know, I mean, I'm from New England, you know, Sturbridge
Okay.
Village and then
Funny.
North Church and stuff like
Okay.
that. And you put signs on them so that people know they're historic.
Right. Yeah, nobody gets plaques, but if you want to put plaques on, that's fine. And again, it's just, most plaques are simple and brass or something compatible, and that's just fine. I guess the other thing to mention is two of the synagogues. I'm not going to pronounce them correctly, but I think it's Shari Zedek and Mikro Kodesh. Those are individual landmarks already. The one that's on Plymouth Avenue right now, again, part of the district, it would be listed, it would be eligible individually, from what I understand, but it's not protected right now. So again, like, in case anyone doesn't know, preservation prevents demolition, basically. That's the biggest thing that it does do. And there have been demolitions over time. Bud.
If you extend the history past the Jewish community, you wind up extending the types of homes into like ramblers, and design guidelines then are fairly meaningless. So that's, I think, a good reason not to extend it.
Yeah, it becomes tough to really make guidelines for a very eclectic neighborhood. And I still think, I mean, again, a new house could be very much of this time and very modern, but still kind of be compatible. I mean, there's a Julie Snow house going on in the Cathedral Hill neighborhood. It's interesting because it has a gabled roof, and it has, you know, wood shingles and lap siding, but it's also very modern too. So it's kind of like trying to be new but still fit in. And that's the idea, that you would get that rather than something else.
Yes, sorry I came in late, but
It's fine.
could you describe the boundaries of Homewood, or do you have a map?
I have a map. I guess you were late. I have to leave in 5 minutes, so I just want to let people know that. So here's the map. It's bordered on the north by Penn, or
So-
sorry, on the north by Plymouth.
So what are the major highways?
Well, there's no, Penn Avenue,
Okay.
that's the major street. Theoworth Park. Plymouth Avenue is the other major thoroughfare, and then Oak Park to the south. Does anybody else have some questions? I'm happy to, or just anybody else want to talk? Yeah. Oh, that's all.
Hi, my name's Corinna. I'm a lighting design consultant and also a designer, and was just interested in learning more about this neighborhood. I'm actually from St. Paul in the Frogtown area, and I see some similarities between what's going on in Homewood and Frogtown. And I just wanted to pose a question to Alex. I know he has to leave really soon, but a recent post on Facebook was really interesting around parklets. And I wanted to pose a quick question about that. I see a lot of gentrification happening in Frogtown, and a lot of, I would say, not useless architecture, but recently a parklet was built next to Johnny Babies off of Chatsworth and University, and it was gorgeous. It's beautiful. There's landscaping that's been done. It's a big improvement. It's beautiful. I walk by it when I take the train every day, or most days, to work. But no one in the neighborhood uses it. I've never seen one person sit in it. And the irony is I saw someone post something in Duluth next to a picture of a bunch of really happy, delighted people sitting at this parklet in Duluth drinking coffee, and they're very happy. And I just pose the question of, I could be looked at as a gentrifier living in Frogtown because it's mainly a Hmong and African American neighborhood, but that's where I could afford housing. And I look at myself as bringing value to the neighborhood by planting flowers and caring about my neighbors and interacting as far as having a barbecue and inviting my Hmong and African American neighbors. So I'm adding value. And I worry about the architecture that's going up in Frogtown. And so as far as being part of the Homewood neighborhood and being in Frogtown, it's different neighborhoods, but the same types of things are happening. And I feel like we have the same worries. So, Alex, would you like to address that?
I mean, kind of had a lot in that question. I don't know if
Sorry.
you're talking about parklets or gentrification, but I mean, that's one thing to bring up is that housing in Homewood is affordable, and a lot of the population is just, quite frankly, getting older. You know, again, you lived there for 40, 50 years. I mean, when's the next generation going to come in, and who are they going to be? And, you know, you, at one point, were the new generation. So, like I said, change is kind of inevitable, and I guess what I'd just like to leave with, and I know it's a tough issue for the community, and it becomes, again, there's a disconnect in meeting eye to eye with communication, but preservation could be a very useful tool to deal with change moving forward and kind of leaving a legacy to the next generation. And that's the idea. I think like these designation studies should be living documents. They aren't frozen in time. And again, that maybe in 50 years, the designation study would be rewritten and say, hey, there was this community who finally came together and preserved this special neighborhood despite their differences. And, you know, I mean, like I said, I think it comes down to like, we need to create a great city, and the north side needs all these special things that the rest of the city gets, and we got to find a way to do all these things, whether it's, you know, bike lanes or historic districts. Like, we need all this stuff, and I think, again, when you look at other parts of North Minneapolis that have more blight in the housing, Homewood is a special place, and it's just special to say this is like the shining hill of North Minneapolis, basically. And like I said, it's just, it could be a very useful tool to move forward. And I have the feeling that if this designation does not go through, it kind of becomes this, you sort of got to be careful what you wish for. And I don't want to tell horror stories or anything like that, but, you know, if you don't have historic protections, you might get multifamily housing replacing, the stately homes on Washburn Avenue. You might have someone who tears down a modest house and builds something that's a little out of context with the neighborhood. But on the other hand, if community can work with the city and city council members, because like I said, I think they really have been preserving the neighborhood for a long time, and it could really allow all the neighborhood concerns about the financial burdens, which that seemed to me most of it. People just didn't want it to be expensive if it didn't have to be, that they could somehow come in place. And I just say this, it's interesting as an impartial observer, because I don't work on this project anymore. I don't live in the neighborhood. I see great things that preservation does, and I'm a believer in it. But I also want to see how preservation itself can be kind of relevant for our times and not just be this kind of bourgeois thing of keeping house museums, all special and perfect, because it's terrible that it comes down to things like vinyl windows versus wood windows, which is important, but it's also not. And it means a lot to me. How do we make the city great without displacing anyone? So with that, I really have to go. It was fun to chat with everyone. And yeah, most of you have my email address anyway.